Thank you. So, as writers, we are always chasing after interesting stories to tell. But I believe as much as we're drawn to stories, we're also drawn to silences, the things we cannot talk about, taboos, political, cultural, and sexual taboos. And when I look at my own writing over the years, I realize there's a constant effort to perhaps give more voice to the voiceless and to bring the periphery a bit closer to the center, and perhaps to listen to the voices of the neglected, the forsaken, and to make the invisible a little bit more visible. And when I look at my life, I realize the roots of this effort go all the way back to my childhood. In fact, it all began one long, strange summer when I was 7 years old. That year, my parents got officially divorced. But by then, they had been unofficially separate and unofficially disconnected and unofficially not talking to each other at all for so many years that this new stage did not make much of a difference in my life, in my daily life. What would make a difference, however, was the summer. So when the month of May came, it was decided, for a reason still unclear to me, it was decided that I would spend half of the summer holidays next to my paternal grandma and the remaining half of the summer holidays next to my maternal grandma. And I need to tell you at this stage that these two women lived in different cities in Turkey. And back then, when I had this habit, whenever I felt nervous or anxious, I would start to whistle. So whistling all along, I prepared my suitcase, I jumped on a bus, and I went to Izmir, where my first grandma lived. And she seemed very happy to see me, but that happiness lasted only until she opened my suitcase and saw the things that I had brought along. I had brought lots of shorts, it was a hot summer, and I had brought lots of books. It was a long summer, and I loved reading. And she didn't like either. She thought the shorts were too short, they were not the kind of things that a girl should be wearing, and the books were too foreign, they were too Western. They were not the kind of books that I should be reading. And I realized in this house there were only two books. Actually, technically speaking, there was only one book. And that was a book of hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. The other book was up on the wall. It was so high you could not reach it. It was inside this beautiful, shiny, pearly velvet cover. And it was not accessible. And when I asked her about it, she didn't encourage me to touch it either. Whereas I was thinking, since I'm not allowed to read the books inside my suitcase, maybe I can read the books inside the house. Again, she did not encourage me to do that. And in passing, she mentioned something that troubled me. She said that women were not supposed to touch the holy book on particular days of the month because they were dirty. And I didn't understand that. I didn't understand why women were dirty. And if women were dirty, how come men were not dirty? And I said, well, they can wash their hands, before touching it. But she didn't offer a satisfactory explanation. In fact, she never offered a satisfactory explanation. So in this house, my confusion grew. And maybe with my confusion, my nervousness increased. And so I kept whistling all the time, day and night. That also was a problem because Grandma said, if you whistle, you are inviting darkness into the house. And particularly if you whistle after sunset, you will be inviting shaitan. And the thing about shaitan is, whenever he's invited, he comes. And I was scared. I was scared of this world that she portrayed, which was full of darkness and concepts like sin and hell, Jahannam, the fires of hell, and all of that. But not only that, I was also scared of God, of her God, that is. Grandma's God was one big celestial gaze. It was a humongous single eye in the sky, single because God had no equivalent, so it had to be a single eye. And this eye never blinked. This eye never watered, teared. And it was an absolute gaze that watched you the whole time, day and night. And I found that very scary. I found that very suffocating. And then it occurred to me, if he is watching me, the celestial gaze is watching me the whole time, he can also see me in the bathroom. Is that possible? I asked her. You know, there's a roof, we have walls. And she said, of course, you silly. He sees you the whole time. Now, that was very confusing because on the one hand, women are dirty no matter what, you know, even if they wash themselves. And on top of that, when you wash yourself, when you're in the bathroom, you're constantly watched and judged. So what's the point of taking a bath? What's the point of taking a shower? And I decided that from now on, I would never, ever take another shower again. And days went by, weeks went by. I kept my promise. I stuck, you know, with my promise. And in this state, I finished my time with my paternal grandma. And I arrived in Ankara, which is the capital of Turkey, in my maternal grandmother's house. And she was very happy to see me. She gave me a hug. As soon as she hugged me, she said, "You stink." I said, "Of course I stink. I'm not taking a shower anymore. Did you know that God can see you naked in the bathroom?" And there was this moment of silence, a pause. She looked at me, trying to understand whether I was joking. And when she realized that I was dead serious, she started to laugh. I said, "What? You don't believe me? God can see you." And she said, "Honey, I'm sure he has more important things to do." And that was confusing as well because my paternal grandmother's God was a transcendental, judgmental, patriarchal, definitely a masculine, male God. Whereas my maternal grandma talked about the same God as if she were her next door neighbor, you know? Sometimes she quarreled, sometimes they had disagreements, but overall they got along very well. So when people make sweeping generalizations about Muslim women or Muslims, I find it very troubling because how can millions and millions of people be the same when even my own two grandmothers, coming from the same culture, nationality, class, were so different, almost opposite? And the maternal grandmother's house was full of spirituality, irrationality, lots of superstitions. This was a woman who would melt lead to ward off the evil eye. And the house was, you know, full of stories, love stories as well. There was a Quran in this house too, but the Quran was on the shelf. You could touch it, you could take it, you could read it, you could put a bookmark inside, put it back. And inside, and next to the Quran, there were lots of other books, mostly love stories from the Middle East, like Layla and Mejnun, like Ferhat and Shirin, Kerem and Aslı. My grandma loved those books. And now that I look back, I realize maybe my love for stories, storytelling, maybe a little bit of spirituality, magic, surreal, all of that I got from my maternal grandma. But there were also things I learned from my paternal grandma, even though at the time I didn't realize it. It would take me many years to understand this. I think from my first grandmother, I learned one thing, and that was the power of fear. And fear is a very powerful concept. And I come from a country where writers, journalists, poets, academics are no strangers to fear. I come from a country where words are quite heavy. And every Turkish writer, every Turkish journalist, novelist knows that because of a poem you write, because of a novel, because of something you say in an interview, or even a tweet or a retweet, you can get into trouble in one single day. In a day, you can be demonized in pro-government papers, you can be almost lynched on social media, called a traitor, you can be put on trial, maybe arrested, detained, or exiled. And we know this. We have this knowledge at the back of our minds when we produce our work. As a result, when we are writing, we internalize fear. There is widespread self-censorship. But how do you talk about that kind of fear? I think it's very difficult to do that. Firstly, because it's so subtle, it's so diffused, and also it's embarrassing, you know, to talk about self-censorship. but we must talk about it. I think Turkey holds important lessons for progressive-minded people all around the world, because the slide backwards has been both gradual but also with a bewildering speed. Because what happened over there can happen anywhere, and it can even happen here. Turkey shows us that the ballot box in itself is not enough to sustain a democracy. Yeah? So if you do not have a rule of law, separation of powers, women's rights, minority rights, LGBT rights, if you do not have an independent academia, and definitely a free, diverse media, on its own, the ballot box is not enough, because we had, relatively speaking, regular elections. Turkey also shows us that with just one ballot box, you end up with majoritarianism, the dominance of the majority. That is a very different system than a democracy. And from majoritarianism to authoritarianism, it's a very short step and a very fast fall. Turkey also shows us that history does not necessarily always go forward. Sometimes it goes backwards. And generations can make exactly the same mistakes that their great-grandfathers had made, particularly if there's collective amnesia in a society and if we haven't learned from the mistakes of the past. But that said, I also make a distinction between the government and the people. And the people are always ahead of their governments. And there's always an amazing potential there. And when you talk to people, the young people, women, minorities, you will feel much more optimistic. I have many readers in Turkey who will tell you a different story publicly, but then they come and in their private space, they become different people. Just to give you an example, I have many readers who are quite xenophobic. So if you ask their opinion about Armenians or Greeks or Kurds or Jews, they will tell you negative things. But then they come on a book signing day and they say, you know what, I read your book, and the character that I loved most was this character. And maybe that character is Armenian or Greek or Jew or Kurd. I have many homophobic readers because this is the way they were raised. This is the only narrative they have heard. But then again, they come and they say, you know, the character in this book that I most associated with was this one, and maybe that character is transsexual or bisexual or gay. And I've often thought about this, you know, how does it happen that people who are publicly more intolerant, how is it possible that when they are alone, because you read a novel on your own, the novel is the art of solitude. The writer is alone, the reader is alone. So how is it possible that the same people, when they are alone, when they retreat into their inner space, they become, relatively speaking, a little bit more ready to connect with the other? And I don't think that's a coincidence, because fascism is a collectivistic disease. You need masses, you need collectivities, you need synchronized energy, you know, everyone chanting at the same time. You need a flow. The only thing that breaks that flow is individuality and that inner space. That is why I find tribalism very, very dangerous. And what happened in Turkey, we became a much more polarized society, is happening in many other parts of the world. We're becoming more and more tribalistic. The easiest thing is to retreat into political tribes and to talk about the other political tribe from the safety of our own tribe. The easiest thing is to widen that gap between political ghettos, cultural ghettos. But my concern, my worry is that when societies become so polarized, so tribalistic, the only person who benefits from this is the demagogue himself. Demagogues love dualities. They love this distinction between us versus them. They don't want a society that has a culture of coexistence anyhow. So if I may leave you with this thought, it's a thought that I believe will be important for many people in the next decade. It's a thought that occupies my mind as well. I go back to my grandmothers. They were so different. The gap between them was wide enough even back then, but it became wider and wider. Is it possible to bridge that gap? Is it worth trying to bridge that gap? Because we live in a very fast-moving, in a very liquid world. And when things are so complicated, so complex, sometimes there's only two paths. We will either be burning bridges or building bridges. And that's a choice to make. But I do know that a world that does not have bridges means a world that lacks connections. A world that lacks connections is a world that lacks stories. And when there are no stories, it means there's no empathy. So I do know that a world that lacks empathy will be a much, much darker place than this. Thank you.